This is Through the Apex. All right, here we go. First episode of Through the Apex. For those who may or may not watch, we're going to start out, introduce you to my co-streamer, Just Another Red Shirt. How you doing, sir?
Hello. Doing very well, thanks.
So, might as well just jump right into it. I do want to say I do love my intro. Glad I put that together. But yeah, let's get into it. So the question posed is, which is more indicative of a top tier manufacturer in racing? Is it winning the drivers' championship or winning the overall manufacturers' championship? And the reason I brought this up was because I had seen a discussion in another YouTube video's comment section where an individual was claiming that the manufacturer, this was a NASCAR video, and between the years of 63 and to 69, Ford had won the manufacturer's championship all of those years, so 7 years. And it was brought up that, yeah, but their drivers didn't win the championship. It was the cars winning the championship. But 3 of those years were either Dodge or Plymouth, Chrysler products. And then 1 year was kind of a fluke with a backup driver driving 7 different manufacturers and happening to win the championship that year for the driver. So, I mean, the original argument was, between Chrysler's 426 Hemi in NASCAR and Ford's 427 and or 429 Boss engine, which one was the better engine? But in turn, it kind of branched off into manufacturer. So I'm gonna pose the question to you first, and I'll get your ideas, and then we'll bounce it back and forth, because I have a definitive, to me, I mean, and again, these are just opinions. This is not a definitive answer to the question. It's just how I and or Just Another Red Shirt view this situation. There is no necessarily correct answer. It's just how you see it from your perspective. Go, Richard. Go ahead.
Well, the Constructors' Championship is different in every racing series. It's a bit different with NASCAR versus Formula One versus Indy. The number of cars that a constructor can have in the field is, relatively speaking, pretty different between those series. To me, the point of a Constructors' Championship is that that's the incentive for constructors to enter the sport, so that they spend all the money they have to spend to do it, not necessarily to determine who's the best. The Drivers' Championship is a little more like that, in that you have to score more points and be more consistent than the other drivers, and you get points for your races. And you can pretty well rest assured that the person who wins the Drivers' Championship in a given season is probably the guy who had the best season overall and has the talent to take advantage of that.
Right.
However they calculate manufacturers or constructors championship, whether it's NASCAR, Formula One, whatever. I mean, even in Formula One, it's varied over the years. Used to be that the top scoring driver counted towards the constructor championship, but the second ranked driver that didn't score as many points or didn't score any points, whatever, even if he scored points, he didn't count because they didn't have enough. Well, that's nonsense. To me, that's nonsense. If you field a 2-car team and you hire 2 drivers and both of those guys score points, the constructor should get credit. However, as I think you pointed out backstage, it's possible in some race events like NASCAR for a manufacturer to put a huge number of cars into the field, because NASCAR in particular was the big 3. So they could afford to provide all kinds of teams with the engine and the body templates and everything they needed. If it's really early NASCAR, they actually drove real cars. Later NASCAR, they drove full on race cars that just looked like road cars.
Right.
But they had the engines, and then they tweaked them and they tuned them. But the bottom line is that, to me, the team matters more than the constructor. When in Formula One, at least you sometimes had a team that was a constructor, like Lotus or like Brabham in the
Or
early
McLaren,
days,
yeah.
60, or McLaren in the early days. Yes. Now, that was a deal where if they won the Constructors' Championship, I would take that seriously.
Right.
But if a racing team buys cars from a constructor and then they go and set them up and hire the race car drivers and go out and do well, the constructor had less to do with that than the team did in many cases, because
Right.
no car shows up at a racetrack competitive out of the van the first time, out of the transporter the first time.
Yeah, it's pretty rare.
They have to be tweaked, and especially in high-end racing, when you're in the really serious racing series. And I include NASCAR in that, by the way. But you've got to get your engine guy to tear the engine down and put it back together the way he wants it, and you've got to have the suspension guy go in and put in the jacks and be able to make the car corner the way you want on this track versus that track. There are so many things that change from the time a car is built to the time it turns a wheel on a racetrack and becomes competitive. That, to me, the Constructors' Championship is a marketing tool. I don't care how they figure it out.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And that's kind of why I didn't necessarily include Formula One, because there were so many different like changes to the point system, and then changes to how manufacturers are viewed within the racing series. And again, we're talking about the history of Formula One, not even just the current way it's laid out. Because, you look at the 70s and there's, like you were saying, there's 90% of the field was a Ford engine, but that didn't count for manufacturers' championship points. So yeah, I was more focused on what the series that were distinctly like, okay, you're driving a Ford, that's a Ford car. It gets, manufacturers' points, whether you were directly associated with Ford or an offshoot or whatever. And again, it's not just NASCAR. It's like the World Sports Car Championship. If you look at it from, early 60s on through, you had these huge swaths of time frames where, 60 through 65, it was Ferrari. And if you weren't driving a Ferrari, you probably weren't winning, but it's where they got most of their manufacturers' points from, is they had so many cars in the field.
Right.
And then when Ford comes along, they did the same thing. I know Ford versus Ferrari, the movie, doesn't represent this necessarily really well, because they show a total of 3 cars run in 66, when in reality it was like 7.
Yes.
Right. And Ford understood that, and they dumped as much as they could into those races. And then when they were done with it, they walked away and the cars were still winning all the way to 69.
Yes.
So they weren't officially involved, but they were still the manufacturer.
Yep.
And then you get to 70, and it's, for most of the 70s, it's Porsche
Porsche,
across
yes.
the board. And it was the same thing. They'd show up with 6 manufacturer teams and then another 6 or 8 privateer teams, and it was like half the field was Porsches.
Yep.
So, yeah, when looking at this, I mean, and again, back to the NASCAR side of the argument, it's, to me, it was the driver championship told me more about the team necessarily than the manufacturer, but it still rings true. They took this company's equipment and made it the absolute best.
Right.
You know, and it kind of leads me to believe that manufacturers championships are a little hollow in that, yeah, you're providing the engine. And like you said, over the years, it started out a real car that was changed to be a race car to eventually just a pure tube frame car that had nothing to do with the manufacturer. And in many cases, you look at like some of Rusty Wallace's cars, when he made the transition from Buick to Ford, he had his favorite frame, the favorite car that he wanted to drive most, because they had, chassis set up for different racetracks. Exactly. And he had his A#1 frame rebodied from a Buick to a Thunderbird. So it was completely irrelevant, which manufacturer he drove for, even though when he was driving a Buick got the manufacturer points. And when he was driving the same car as a Ford got the manufacturer points.
Right.
So and they had and the guy who built the frame, wasn't basing it on any specific template. In fact, most of the, like when you get to like 70s and 80s and even 90s, the way the NASCAR rules were, you had to have a floor pan that was used in an actual car. So what they did was they built their tube frame, cut the floor pan out of some random car, and welded it in. And it didn't even necessarily have to be the manufacturer that the car was going to.
Right.
So in most cases, they were Chevy Impala or Malibu floorboards based on whatever, wheelbase they were using. And that was it. So, I mean, it was a Chevy, floorboard in a quote unquote Pontiac bodied car originally. And then it was a Chevy floorboard in a Ford bodied car. So it completely just didn't matter at that point.
Yes, exactly. And at that point, who do you call the constructor?
Yeah.
The guy who built the engine?
South Carolina.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, is it the guy who built the frame? Is it the guy who built the floor pan? The guy who built the engine? Or the guy who built the body? I mean,
right. And none of those are the manufacturer.
And none of those are from the manufacturer.
Right.
So yeah, it make in NASCAR in particular, knowing what I do about NASCAR and the way they made their cars and set up their cars, yeah, they use whatever worked.
Right.
And
exactly.
At the end of the day, the car had to look like the car the fan wanted to root for. If you were rooting for Bill Elliott, it had to look like a Thunderbird.
Right, exactly.
And as long as it looked like a Thunderbird and it had Bill Elliott's number on the side, you were rooting for it.
Right.
But
and more than likely,
what is Ford
Thunderbirds on Monday?
Right. And yeah, you probably go back Thunderbird. But how much did Ford have to do with that car? Not a whole lot.
Nothing.
Maybe they built the engine that the team started with. But that's about it.
I don't even know. I wouldn't even go that far with it because
okay.
a lot of the teams had their own engine department, even that early, like in the mid '80s and even before that. Like, you might have gotten a block, maybe, but because of the way the rules started to lay out, everybody was running the same cubic inches. Everybody's running the same intake, the same carburetor. Like you could set a Chevy engine and a Ford engine and Pontiac. I mean, that would have been an all GM anyway. But or even when Dodge was still in the series, when they were running the small block engines, the 358 cubic inch engines, and you take the valve covers off, you wouldn't be able to tell hide nor hair between any of them because they were all custom aluminum blocks and it didn't relay much from the manufacturer at that point.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, even going back to the 60s where this original discussion came from. Oh, look at that. Papa Cotton's showing up in the chat there. Hey, what's up, Book? You had cars that, like, in the early to mid 60s, they were still vaguely, they would buy a car or get a car from a dealership or from the manufacturer, and they made their adjustments to the car. So roll cage, any kind of bracing that needed to happen, and whatnot. So it was still vaguely based on an actual car.
Right.
And then once like 65, 66 came around, then you started to see those full tube chassis cars that came around, and NASCAR, to kind of keep it vaguely manufacturer based, would say, okay, the car has to fit a certain template. So if you're coming at me in 66 with a quote unquote Ford, it needs to match, the Fairlane or Galaxy or whatever you were running. So they put the template over top, just like they do nowadays. Does it fit the template? And then they made them use the floor pans. Well, then when they realized they could use any floor pan because the the rules were so vague that it didn't matter. They were just ripping floor pans out of whatever they had available. And it was irrelevant what manufacturer it came from. The only thing that was truly manufactured was the engines themselves. So you could kind of hang your hat on, okay, well, was the Hemi better than the 427 side oiler or the 429 Boss? And in reality, you, like I was saying, Ford had so many teams under its banner that they wouldn't have one team run away with it. They would have a number of teams placing well to get manufacturers points. So they just had deeper pockets, so to speak.
But depending, it didn't matter how deep the pockets were, particularly in NASCAR, but in general in other sports, especially companies like Ferrari and Lotus, or Dan Gurney, who didn't want to sell road cars, but I'm sure he was perfectly willing to sell you an Eagle if you wanted to buy one from him. The old adage, run on Sunday, sell on Monday, is pure marketing speak for why the company goes into racing in the first place. And to me, the manufacturer's championship was the carrot that racing series dangled for constructors or big car companies to get involved. Ford v Ferrari is actually the exception to the rule. That was just Henry Ford II being absolutely pissed off at Enzo Ferrari.
For something outside of racing, honestly.
Exactly. It was a business deal that went south fast. But no, I think most of the time the Constructor Championship and everything you've been talking about and that we've discussed is that basically the Driver's Championship is something that people compete for individually. That matters to a certain extent. I mean, obviously, you got to have the right car. You got to be on the right team. We've seen look at Colin Chapman's last year when he tried to run his own car and it was a complete and utter disaster. He didn't even win Monte Carlo, which he just owned for years. He was a 5-time winner, but he couldn't win anything in his own car. So you had to be in the right car. You had to be with the right team. They had to have the technology to be at least competitive, give you that chance. Manufacturer's championship, depending upon how much the constructor is involved in building the car. And I'm sorry, you can tell me that Honda had a racing team and they had Honda engineers engineering the car. But the fact of the matter is that Honda Formula One cars bore and still bear little to no resemblance outside of a couple of odd technical things. They went, ooh, that works, and grabbed it and worked it into a road car.
Cars. Yeah.
But there's no Honda in the world, not even the Acura NSX, that could even come close to a Honda Formula One car. And Honda was famously rather unsuccessful in Formula One when they were building their own cars and engines.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest technologies that they may have pulled from that was like the VVTi, because that did end up in a number of their, like both Toyota and Honda both kind of did that. And it was both derived from racing. But in most cases, and that's, again, why I kind of like leaned away from Formula One, because what you see on the track in a Formula One race isn't anything you're ever going to see in a standard showroom. You might find something close in a Ferrari showroom, but at that point, you're so rich, who cares?
Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah. That's a money no object case there. You
exactly
won the lottery,
right.
Yeah.
Now, I do think the win on Sunday, sell on Monday did matter for a while in NASCAR because you could see that it did affect how company sales worked and
Yeah.
which cars within a company line sold the most. But once the cars started to less resemble, especially when you get to the 80s where Pontiac and Buick started running the front wheel drive platform cars, but as rear wheel drive stock cars, it didn't matter because
No.
what I'm seeing on the track on Sunday is nothing like what I'm seeing in the showroom.
No, not at all.
Right,
And
not
if
even
you've ever,
close.
and if you've ever driven a front wheel drive car on a racetrack, you'll know why they didn't do that.
Well, yeah. I mean, never mind the fact that the rules were very specific, but yeah. I mean, it's not exactly especially on a banked oval or something like that. It just doesn't work all that well.
No.
But yeah, I did find that interesting. Like, okay, so you say Ford won the manufacturers championship between those years, and I say, well, yeah, but you had these drivers for other manufacturers that won the drivers championships within that time frame. Which one is more important and which one is more influential? To me, like as a spectator, if Richard Petty takes his well, and say 64 when he won his Plymouth with a 426 wedge and wins outright, to me that meant more than but Ford won the manufacturers championship. I didn't give a crap about Ford winning the manufacturers championship because at the end of the day, who got the trophy?
Right.
Which driver got the trophy, I should say. And
well, the way you worded the question was a little bit different before. It was which of the two, it seemed to me, was which of the two is more indicative of a good manufacturer or constructor. If the question is which of the two is actually more significant of achievement,
that's kind of
that
more
to me, that's easy because I've already made the case that the manufacturer's championship was a marketing tool, nothing more. The individual driver's championship is an indication that somebody put in the time, put in the effort, was there every time at the track, and was at least in the points, if not winning races, and managed to accumulate whatever the SKIS system was. At one time, it was the best 5 races in Formula One. I don't know what it is in NASCAR. I don't even know how NASCAR scores now.
Oh, now it's a joke.
Yeah.
Now it's, you get guys that never win a race but end up in the, whatever they call that, the playoffs,
the shootout,
the shootout, and they can win the whole thing at the end of it, and it's like you won 2 races all year.
Yeah.
Like how does that even work?
How does that even? What the hell is even that?
That was one of their biggest blunders was the chase and all that because it just makes it makes driving the rest of the year. You could get away with driving 3/4 or 7/8, not pushing 100%. Now, not to say that the drivers would do that, but the teams would be like, no, that's all right. We can come in 5th here. Like they're not so concerned with getting first because they know they can still make the chase later on.
Right.
But back then, it was just straight up, you got X amount of points for a win, and that went every single week. And they had enough races on the schedule, right, where you had a ton of points at the end of the season if you were a runaway team.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why I was like, well, to sit there and say, well, Ford had the best engine. No, Ford had the most engines.
Right.
The driver that won in 64 had the best engine. Whether Chrysler had anything to do with that is maybe not.
Right.
Because again, it was the team prepping the engine and prepping the car and whatever.
Exactly. And make no mistake, what the team does with the equipment that they buy can make a world of difference,
Mm-hmm.
both positive and negative. You can screw up an otherwise perfectly reasonable race car if you don't know what you're doing. And if you do know what you're doing, you can turn a mediocre race car into a race winner.
Right.
Again, with the right driver, which is what it really comes back to, is the driver is the guy that has to make the thing go around the track faster than everybody else, whatever track it is.
Right.
Whether it's oval, road, endurance, sprint, it doesn't matter. So at the end of the day, to me, the driver's championship is the guy who took what he was given and his own natural talent and turned it into a better result overall than anybody else.
Right.
Now that means something to me. A constructor or a manufacturer's championship, you're right. I mean, at that point, you can flood the field with cars. You can sell, $5,000 race cars to any idiot that says I want to run it at Rockingham or whatever. And if you put enough cars in the field and they actually manage to score a point and you get it, you basically just bought a point towards the constructors championship.
Right. Exactly.
That's really all it is.
Right. I mean, you still have to, like, not to like poo-poo on Ford's involvement or Chrysler's involvement or whatever, but it does come down to the how much money did you want to invest in winning. In that case, again, putting a good engine package together so that those teams have an engine still running at the end of the race is important. Right. But you don't necessarily need those teams to perform in the top 5 to get a manufacturer's championship. You could have top 15, top 20, and 7 of those cars be your car, and you're going to be doing better than the next guy who only had 4 cars.
Right. And that's now a case of you're really good at building a lot of fairly mediocre race cars.
Right.
Is one way of looking at it. You are great at being just ahead of the middle of the pack, and you have a ton of cars there, and that is earning you a lot of points in small increments.
Right.
I want to know who won the lottery. Who got the checkered flag first. Everybody after that is the first, and the guy after that is the first loser. Because I used to drive race cars, and having 20 cars in the top 25 or 30 or something is like, so,
right.
I was in the top 20 of a race. I mean, there were only 20 cars in the race, but I was in the top 20. Right. So I can say that, and people who don't know what I was driving or where I was driving might be like, wow, you were in the top 20. That's impressive.
Right.
Yeah, it was a Skip Barber race.
It's how you present that information. Hey, I finished in the top 10. Only 10 cars finished, but I was there.
I was there.
I was there. I didn't crash.
Done that too. But
you're right.
No, it's always struck me when I started researching this, when you contacted me about this and I started looking into it, I've kind of went, I don't see what this is actually for. And then it finally hit me between the eyes. It was like, this is marketing. This is the kind of thing that Enzo Ferrari would love. It would give him prestige. It would give him position. It would get people to buy his road cars so that he could finance his race team.
Yeah, exactly.
That's why Ferrari wanted to be the constructors champion. Suckers would buy his cars. Hollywood celebrities, people like that.
What's even funnier is, like, as soon as he got any opposition, he hated it.
Yeah,
he absolutely despised not being the only guy out there. Ford, he stuck it out through Ford's winning at Le Mans specifically. But then once Porsche came in and basically just kicked him in the groin, that was it. He was like, we're going to Formula One, and that's the end of that.
Yep.
Because he knew the manufacturers in Formula One, or, vaguely manufacturers, the teams in Formula One were easy pickings. He was already there.
Yeah.
But his focus wasn't necessarily there. It was split between Le Mans and Formula One. Once he knew he didn't have a prayer at Le Mans, it was all about Formula One. And for the longest time, his major opposition was either himself with bad decisions, but also, Lotus or
Yes.
McLaren a little bit. Though McLaren's success in Formula One didn't necessarily take off until you get to the 80s.
Right.
They were sporadically doing well because, again, Bruce McLaren had kept dividing his time amongst multiple series to where, his final day was actually testing a Can-Am car and not a Formula One car.
Right.
So dividing his time definitely, I would say it hurt his chances of being more significant earlier on, like through the 70s, than him, after he had passed and McLaren became a force in the 80s with the MP44 and the drivers that drove that car. It's interesting. Like Ferrari was just like, I'm not going to win at this World Sports Car Championship anymore. I'm done. And he really did not, like, he stuck to his guns. And even after his passing, Ferrari stuck to their guns and didn't go back sports car racing, like other than GT3 series stuff. And most of that was privateer teams. Like they provided them a car.
Right.
But it wasn't truly Ferrari as a manufacturer until they built, what was it, the 333 SP, which was a prototype, a Le Mans prototype that ran in World Sports Car Championship. And even then, they still had to fight the Porsche teams.
Yes.
So they weren't as successful. Yeah.
Yeah. No. And Ferrari was a perfectionist, and he was a my way or the highway guy. I mean, that comes across in a number of books, in the movie Ford v Ferrari. It comes across in the movie Rush with Niki Lauda. How Niki was received in the Ferrari team when he was the number 2 driver, and when he was the number 2, like I said, that was when the Constructors' Championship was the guy who scores more points in a race is what counts towards the constructor. So
Right.
They wanted a first-class primary driver who got the best of everything and the most attention from the mechanics. And then they had another guy who was there to fill a slot on the grid. And if he was able to do well, that was nice. But it didn't count toward Ferrari's marketing. Right. And Niki Lauda came in because Regazzoni said, I'm only going if he comes with me. And Ferrari was a bit nonplussed, and they showed that beautifully in the movie. But he says, when Niki sits in the car and tells the engineer from Ferrari, "It's a piece of shit."
Yes.
And the guy goes, "You can't say that." He says, "Why not? It is.
It's a Ferrari.
It's a Ferrari. I don't care if it's a Ferrari. It's whatever."
Right.
So Niki was a.
Well, I was going to say, he called it a pig that understeered in every corner.
Yes.
I mean, he thrashed that car.
Yes. I mean, and a lot of Ferraris in the 50s and 60s are not today known for their handling. They're known for their power and the beauty of the lines, but their brakes are shit, and they don't corner very well, some of them.
Oh, yeah.
And
well, he was one of the last to include or to utilize disc brakes.
Yes.
He was bound and determined to run drum brakes until the end of time. And eventually he was just losing, all of his drivers were like, I can't stop the car.
Right. But yeah, the Ferrari was very, very pig-headed in many ways. And he had his own program, and there were times when it worked for him brilliantly. And there were times when it held him back badly. The drum brakes is a perfect example.
Right.
But Formula One is uncompromising. IndyCar is probably close to being as unforgiving in terms of equipment. And you don't run last year's car, and if you do, you better hope you have a really good engine and a really good driver. Because chassis changes year on year are going to leave you for dead very quickly. Formula One, it's even worse. NASCAR had the luxury that, as you said, they basically built whatever car they wanted, and then they just had to fit a body on it that looked good and a floor pan that would meet the regulations, and
Right.
they were
Yeah.
ready to go race. So
Yeah.
it's
Not,
hard. It's probably hardest. It's probably hardest to use NASCAR as an argument for a constructors championship indicating quality of construction from a car maker than in
right.
any other series. If there were a series I wouldn't use to try to make that case, even though I wouldn't make the case in the first place, the last series I would use would be NASCAR.
Right. Right. Because it was more about quantity than quality, or
Yeah.
it was an equal portion of each.
Yes.
Whereas
And
you need far more quality in those, like Formula One and IndyCar. Though I would say even now, IndyCar is a spec race series anyway, because everybody's running the same chassis, and they've got one of two manufacturers for engines. So it's
yeah,
like you're either running a Honda or a Chevy,
right.
and that's it.
And there's a reason I haven't watched an IndyCar race in the last 10 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I will say this: from what I have seen of recent races, I mean, they're close races. I just can't. I'm not a big oval fan to begin with. I know, and it's funny that I brought this up based on NASCAR, but it's running in circles is cool if you're doing it, but
Yes.
it's really boring if you're watching it.
Well, you need a very informed spectator. I will say this. After having driven the South Oval at New Hampshire Motor Speedway as part of a driving school, my last driving school that I went to, that was a long time ago. But I will say I had a completely different understanding of watching an oval race. Because I'd always done road racing. I'd always done autocross, or I'd done some road race course, a couple of tracks that I drove on. But to have included that enormous curve in the 1 mile oval at New Hampshire Motor Speedway in our driving school course was an eye opener. Because,
Right.
for one thing, after the first session, the instructor pulled us all together and said, I'd just like to point out that unless you're driving an Indy car or a Formula One car, you do not have to brake for the first turn for the South Oval. All I want you to do is let off the throttle at just before you get to the brake markers, and then start by coasting to marker 1 and turning in. And if that's easy, do it again and only coast to marker 2 and turn in. You can turn in any of those places because they're not that far apart. What they're there for is for a really fast car to stab the brakes, turn the wheel, get the car to rotate, and then go into the banking.
Right.
And 85 miles an hour coming up the straightaway and going, okay, lift off, 3, 2, turn, gas. And all of a sudden, the car's going around the oval. You're like, I didn't think it would do that.
Well, yeah. I mean, when it weighs slightly more than a paperclip.
Well, I was in my own personal road car, and it was front wheel drive. The only way it turned in is if I lifted off. So
Right.
I was like, but so in a regular road car, you're surprised at how big that. You think in terms of highway on and off ramps where they mark them at 25 to 35 mile an hour speed limit.
Mm.
You're driving into this curve at 80 miles an hour, and it looks like an on ramp.
Right.
Except it keeps going, and it's like the Energizer Rabbit of corners. It just keeps going and going and going and going. And
Right.
you're sawing back and forth at the wheel all the way through it because you're trying to maintain the line you want. It's totally different from driving, a quick left and a right and this and that on a road course. You're driving a sloppy street car, and you're driving it on a massive oval turn. And it's totally different. So having done it, I can watch a NASCAR race now, figuring those things are closer to, they're not my street car. They have slicks and they have, completely customized suspensions.
Yeah.
But they're not Indy cars. They're not Formula One cars. They barely have any brakes, and by comparison. And
Right.
so watching these guys do this and driving 2 lanes around an oval going, oh boy, been there, done that, didn't buy the t-shirt. I had a guy go underneath me in the South Oval. Traffic in there, it's a different thing. You're right. It's a lot more fun to do than it is to watch, but it's a lot of fun to watch if you know what you're watching. But in general, that's true of any motorsport.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of people watch NASCAR because they're waiting for a crash.
That is true. Yeah, I mean, you get the guys that like you said, that are more knowledgeable on the technical aspect, where it's like, okay, you see this here, this is why he did this, this is why he's down low instead of up high, like all the other cars are up high. You know, then you can get a different appreciation for it. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, you look at NASCAR and it's a lot of running around in circles, and then, oh my God, this is correct. Yeah. And when you watch the highlights, if you watch them past tense, that's all they show are, you know, this guy bumped this guy, he went into the wall. This guy got tangled up and it took 7 cars out. You know, and that those are the highlights. And then, you know, who actually crossed the finish line at the end of it all. But you brought up exit ramps, and I do have one story where equipment becomes very, very important. I had a 95 Mustang GT that had some additional work done to it. Had an engine that was a little bit more than stock. Had a hot cam in it. It was fairly quick, and it handled well because of 2 pieces. Specifically, polyurethane bushings in all of the suspension points and massive rear tires, like 325 wide rear tires, gargantuan tires. The problem I ran into was the tires that I had, even though they were wide, they were very much a street tire. They were Sumitomo. I can't even remember what model they were, but they were fairly hard, not soft.
Right.
And I came off an exit ramp, not even in the range you're talking about, more like 40 to 45. And because of the way the bushings were, if you've ever driven a car with polyurethane bushings, they're great until they're not. And then suddenly you're backwards. And they give you minimal warning about that coming.
Right.
The tires being hard, I didn't get a lot of squeal out of the tires. So I'm going through this turn, and suddenly the bushings reach their maximum and decide to push back.
Yep.
And the car pointed itself towards the guardrail. And of course, I'm shitting bricks. I counter steer. I let off the throttle gently. The car comes back around, but because the tires, again, being hard and the bushings being like, what the fuck are you doing? It spun back the other way. And I ended up 180ing it, hitting the inside curb, which it went over into an embankment. Granted, it wasn't super steep, so I just kind of slid down the embankment. But in the process, it hit both rear rims as I was backwards straight onto the curb and bent both rims, blew the tires off of both rears. And to correct that issue, after I got the rims fixed, I moved from those Sumitomos to a set of Nitto 555s on the rear, which were like low-level track day tires. So I wasn't going to get like 90,000 miles out of these tires, not even close. I might have gotten, I don't know, maybe 15,000 out of them, which for what they cost. But to go around that same turn, it never gave me a question. It went, okay, that's what we're doing. Whoop, right around a turn. Never had an issue. So yeah, I'm very familiar with off ramps in the worst way possible.
Well, where I used to live in Massachusetts, they seem to have a penchant for putting off ramps in places they didn't have quite enough, or on ramps, either one, where they didn't have quite enough room for them. So they were infamous for having on and off ramps that tightened up in the middle, which to a
Yeah.
race car driver is called a decreasing radius turn.
Mhm.
And you have to know that's coming, because you are cruising along this curve at a nice steady pace, and everything is happy hunky and dory, and then all of a sudden you come to what looks like, well, to you in the car, by the time you see it, if you don't know it's coming, it looks like a right hand turn, and you're like, uh-oh. Well, there are a lot of cars where once you're in a turn, you don't want to get on the brakes.
Yeah.
Be early
It'll unsettle it.
1980s yuppie killer BMWs come immediately to mind. Mine did too. The 73 that I had was not a good car to get on the brakes in the middle of a corner. So the thing, the thing with a car is that what it does when it exceeds the limits is what used to be called handling, back when cars had bias ply tires, and that happened on a kind of a regular basis. What I think a lot of people don't realize nowadays, whether it's whether it's their little Honda sitting outside the garage, or it's a Formula One car or any other race car, is most of these cars work perfectly well right up until the instant when they don't work in
Right,
terms of
everything
a
fails.
corner, like your Mustang, and all of a sudden the Mustang tossed you the medicine ball and went, "It's all yours, champ. Take us out of this." And that's it. Knowing what your car will do in that situation is actually rather important, which is why when I was younger, I don't know if anybody does this anymore, but you should go to like an empty parking lot on a rainy Sunday when nobody was there, because
Right.
none of the stores had opened yet, and you drive around the parking lot just cognizant of where the light poles were, because you don't want to appear. Well, back then you couldn't appear in a YouTube video for being an idiot and running into a light pole.
Yeah.
But you're learning what happens when your car loses grip because you've turned it too much or accelerated too much, is worth knowing. And I hate to say it, but a lot of modern cars either break loose at the front, especially if they're front wheel drive, or they break loose at all four wheels at the same time, which effectively means that you've got four wheels on casters,
Yeah.
which isn't any better. So, it's worth trying. It's worth finding out, because as you found out going around an on ramp, that the rear tires can go away like instanter is not something you want to find out when you're on a public road.
Mm.
It's a really bad surprise.
Yeah. I mean, I give myself some credit for keeping it out of the guardrail and not screwing up the body of the car, because I didn't do any damage to the physical car itself, just the rims.
Yes. Just the rims.
But yeah, it was the same scenario you were talking about. It was a gradual off ramp that decreased radius, and it was right at the decrease when I started to put more wheel into it, and the fronts were doing fine. It was the backs that were like, no, we're not doing this.
Yeah.
And then of course they didn't.
Yeah. And I mean, that's learning how to deal with that. Again, is, on a skid pad is a good idea. On a wet parking lot is a good idea. Learning to do that on an off ramp is a bad idea.
Yeah. Well, and it wasn't even like the conditions weren't bad. It was summer, so the pavement was warm. It wasn't wet. Like, I'm out in Arizona, so it was, the pavement was probably 110 degrees. If anything, that's the optimal condition for a tire.
Right.
Because you want it to kind of sink in and dig on that asphalt. And
right.
Yeah, no, those tires weren't going to do that. And I'll tell you this, I'm never, ever, ever, ever going to buy a Sumitomo tire ever again.
Well, I'll never buy a Goodyear Eagle GT again, because it made my life a misery in a Formula Ford, and it made my life a misery in the Ford Probe GT. They're unforgiving tires with a very bad performance at high slip angles. So
Yeah.
if you don't catch a skid or a spin instantly, you're probably not going to get back with those
Right.
tires. And there are street tires that are not forgiving, and they're not a good idea to buy. A street tire that lets go gradually, makes squealing noises when you start to bother it a little bit, is actually a lot safer on the road. It's a pain in the ass on the track, but it's a lot
Yeah.
safer on the road because it starts to warn you, you're starting to get a little aggressive here, Charlie Brown. You want to back off just a touch? Thank you very much. So, you won't go as fast on those, but you're far less likely to wind up bass backwards with a police car following you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting too, because like you bring up the Goodyears, and Goodyears, those tires, those especially the Eagle GTs, a lot of that was stemmed from the design of the Gator backs, if you can remember them.
Yes.
Which were designed for performance cars only. You could get them in any size,
right,
but they weren't designed for those cars. So the Gator backs, you typically found those on like high-end Mustangs, Camaros, Corvettes, and at one point you could even get them on the Testarossa.
Right.
And they were fine when the whole car was designed for that. But yeah, they typically didn't do well on smaller vehicles or, performance sedans. I know for a long time, the police used a hard compound version of that tire on the Crown Vics. And, and you'd always hear about Crown Vics sliding off the road and smacking into shit in pursuits because the tires weren't designed for the Crown Vic, and the Crown Vic suspension wasn't designed for that tire.
Yeah.
So
they were designed cars that didn't roll.
Exactly.
The Corvette had a very, very almost uncomfortably stiff suspension when it first went on those tires. It was a big, wide tire with an aggressive tread designed for a car that wouldn't tip the tire over at all.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, put it on a little front wheel drive car with a fair degree of body roll, and the Eagle GTs would be like, "What? Huh? What are you doing?"
Well, yes, and they had super stiff sidewalls too, so it was like they didn't, not even just the aggressive in a turn, lean. It was the tire was just unwilling to flex itself to accommodate. So it was just bad all around. I will say this for tires not designed for cars. The best tires I've had on a car that purely was not designed for them was I had a 87 Mazda 323 wagon, right? So front wheel drive again, a lot of back end weight, but I put BFG G-forces on those, and a size up from what was normally on that car, so they looked really kind of meaty on the rims.
Right.
And I could take, with that car, it's a shame that the engine failed on that thing, because I would have drove that thing forever. It handled so amazing for being a shit box wagon, but I could just sling it into a turn, and those G-forces loved it. They were just like, this car's not going fast enough. Okay, whatever.
Right. And there are forgiving tires like that. And if you find a set of them for your car, you'll love them. I mean, the tire. I remember a letter to Road and Track, just general consumer information here. Somebody wrote in and said, I got $1,000 or whatever dollars. This is back in the 80s when $1,000 would actually buy you something. $1,000 to spend on making my car faster. What would you recommend? They said, well, first you should buy yourself a driving school. That's the first thing you should spend the money on. And if you're already into a driving school and you still want to make your car go faster, the second thing you should spend your money on is tires.
Yeah.
So those two things actually make more difference than 200 horsepower in your engine or bigger brakes or a whole new suspension or shocks and struts and all of that other crazy stuff you can do. And you can go absolutely broke playing with that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Ask anybody who's tried to go racing on their own
Yeah.
dime. They'll tell you.
It's not cheap.
No, it's not. But yeah, driving schools, best bang for the buck. And the second one is the tires. And just because your friend's whatever mobile drives great on a set of tires doesn't mean your car will. That's the thing that bites most people in the ass. You know, the tires that work for your car are the best tires for your car, not the best tires in the world, because they probably weren't designed for your car.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you're trying to tootle around on like I said, and pretty much a shit box with really good tires. Yeah, I mean the chart for what you should do, what you shouldn't do. The should do part is, like you said, driving school. You know, get familiar with how to drive a car. Get your car a set of tires that work with the car, and then you work your way up the vehicle. So yes, you do eventually do brakes because you're going to have to stop.
Yes.
Suspension, and as long as that suspension works with the tires you have, because I've seen, like in my case, Sumotomos are probably not horrible. It's just that Sumotomos with polyurethane bushings are the worst thing in the fucking world.
Right.
And you should never do it.
Right.
But I had polyurethane bushings in my 66 Mustang, which granted was like almost 1,000 pounds less than the 95. And what tires did I have on that? When I had the Krager SS's on it, I had just standard, muscle car BFGs, not even the G-Force, just the TA radials.
Right.
And that thing handled amazing. I followed a dude in a the hell was it? Mitsubishi Evo, not just a Lancer, but an Evo, the all-wheel drive Evo, through a set of turns, and I was on him like fucking flies on shit the whole way through it. When we got to the light at the end of all of this, he's just kind of looking over at me like, what the fuck? Because, he's got a rally car. It should outhandle everything. And I'm just sitting next to him like, it's like, why is that thing handle? Like, he's looking at my tires like those things shouldn't do what they're doing. And I'm like, it's not just the tires. It's a lot of other things. It wasn't really low to the ground, so it didn't have like a low center of gravity. It was, it was a 66 Mustang with fairly stock suspension, just polyurethane bushings that made that suspension do a lot more than it would have with rubber bushings.
Right.
Yeah, I had almost zero body roll on that Mustang, and that was ridiculous.
I remember one day driving to work when I had an Audi 2.7 A4, and I got behind, it was silver, and I got behind a silver Audi A6 4.2, the V8 version.
The big
of
one,
the big engine. Really good engine, by the way. And not, and that comes from Jeremy Clarkson. He loved it. But we're driving local roads, and we're driving through traffic, and I'm staying right behind this big Audi. And I can hear him. He's flooring it. He is going to work fast. And I'm right behind him. I'm probably rowing the transmission a little bit more aggressively than he is. But I stayed right behind him, and lo and behold, doesn't he pull into the same damn parking lot that I do?
Yep.
So we each park, and I get out of my car, and the president of my company gets out of his Audi A6 and looks over at me and goes, "How did you stay with me?"
Knowledge.
That's where the driving school came in.
Right. And it kills me too, because for whatever reason, and I still don't get it to this day, Audi doesn't like sending us their hot cars.
Right.
The RSs. Like, if I could get my hands on an RS, I'd be a pig in shit. I love those things. you just can't
Yeah.
get them here.
No, you gray market's the only way, and you don't want to deal with that.
Yeah, it's expensive and annoying, and you're not sure what you're getting really.
Right. But you're right. The RS4 would have been a great car for them to sell in this country. And they never did. And it's a
Yeah, or
shame because it's
even the bigger ones, really, like because they like the RS8 is brutal. Every test I see with an RS8, the thing is nasty quick, and it's like it's this huge 4-door sedan.
Yeah.
But all-wheel drive and big engine, they go fast.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. Yep. No,
Right.
Audi's. Well, that's partly. I don't know. I don't actually. I have no idea why they don't send their sportiest cars here because, at the time I bought the Audi, I wish I'd bought a BMW, and BMW's been eating Audi's lunch here for decades.
Yeah.
In the performance sedan market, I mean, Audi with an RS4, Audi should have given the M series a run for its money. They never bothered. I don't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a number of manufacturers that do that. I mean, the fact that none of the three big sedan manufacturers in Germany, BMW, Mercedes, or Audi, give us their wagons because they don't think we're going to buy them. They just keep throwing SUVs at us. And it's like, nah. They like, I've searched around and when BMW did send us wagons, when wagons were still a thing, I could have gotten basically, like you've seen my BMW, it's an 03 540i M Sport. At that time, they made a wagon version of that car.
Yes.
We didn't get the M Sport edition. We only got the 525 wagon, which was on, smaller rims, taller tires, and a 6-cylinder instead of the M Sport, bigger rims, low profiles, and full suspension. And it just drives me nuts because if I would have found a wagon version of that car, I would have bought it.
Yeah. And the 325, I mean, the thing you say about the engine in that car was it was smooth.
Oh yeah.
It was not a barn burner, and it would not,
Yeah, it didn't have a ton of horsepower.
It didn't have a ton of horsepower. It was more oriented on torque. So it was great getting across the intersection, and then you just cruised.
Right.
BMW made much more interesting engines and cars than that. And for that to be their wagon offering, a 325 wagon, is like, oh, at that point you just buy a minivan. It's cheaper, right. And it's just as boring.
Yeah, and this isn't even the first BMW I've had. I had a 90 325i 4-door that was from Dynan, the Dynan BMW dealership in California. And if you've ever heard of Dynan, they're like, they're an external dealership, kind of like how Baldwin Chevrolet was for Camaros and Novas and Corvettes. It was, we can get you one of those, but we can also build this. And it was effectively that car on steroids.
Right.
It's the same thing. Like that little 90 325i had everything that you could get from Dynan at that time. Exhaust, new chip, suspension upgrades. They did not change the rims. That was the one thing I thought was kind of strange because Dynan offered a set of upgraded rims and tires that they didn't get, or at least I didn't get it when I bought it. Somebody may have taken those rims off at some point. And the way Dynan worked was you had to, like, as you threw parts at your car, they had a point system. And if you reached a certain threshold of points, they put the Dynan badge on it. So to get that Dynan badge, you had to hit X number of points in upgrades. And it had the Dynan badge. And the first time I started driving it around, and it had been beat up by its previous owner, So I was kind of like, throwing parts at it to try to get it back to where it should have been. I put an ANSA exhaust on it instead of a Dynon replacement. But the first time I whacked the throttle, it like went, and I was just sitting in a driveway with my foot on the clutch and just gave it kind of one goose, and it slung past the red line. And I was like, what the fuck? That's not supposed to happen. And did it again, and it went whee right past the red line. I was like, what the fuck? And then they started doing research. Come to find out, the Dynon chip removed the red line and moved it up like 1,500 RPM above red line because of the other modifications to the engine.
Right.
So yeah, you could string that thing out. I mean, the red line was at like 5,800 or something like that. You could string that thing straight up to $7,000 and it would not care. It just kept pulling.
Right. Yeah.
That was a fun
And you got to lighten the valve train and do a few other tweaks to be able to change where the red line shows up. Because it's normally valves getting out of sync with pistons that gives you headaches when you over rev an engine.
Yeah, it's typically your valve springs have to be heavier so that they can maintain their positioning when you get that fast in the engine.
Right.
The biggest thing with delivering power at such a high RPM is that it has to still function as if it were at a low RPM up high. And that's how you continuously create power. Because most of the time when you look at like an engine dyno, you can tell where the valves float because it just nosedives off the curve.
Right. Because the compression goes to hell.
Yeah. Well, and as long as you're not, you won't do a ton of damage right away unless it's an interference engine. And then you're going to do a lot of damage.
Right.
Because then you've got very little room between valve and piston. And if anything gets out of sync, you've got valve in piston. And that ends up with parts.
Yeah, that's when the dollar signs start going ka-ching, 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 ka-ching. Yeah.
That's the same sound that the piston makes when it hits the ground.
I wouldn't know.
I've never done it personally, but I can say I have been in cars that have done that.
Oh.
Yeah,
that's an expensive sound.
Oh, yeah. And it'll happen to just about any vehicle if you do it wrong.
Yep.
Guy down the street from me had a 77 or 78 Volare. Just a straight, slant six for Chrysler.
Yep.
It was an everyday car. It was a four-door. It was ugly. It was sand brown with shit brown interior. It was just,
velour
but it was
interior?
A to B.
Was it velour interior?
No, well, it was even cheaper than that. It was the pleather plastic interior.
Oh, God.
But yeah, like he wasn't a real big car guy, so the whole maintenance thing kind of went over his head.
Oh.
And he ran that car like, I don't know if he had hit something and it put a small hole in his oil pan.
Mm-hmm.
And it ran it out of oil. And one of the days I heard driving around and it's just clack, 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 making all kinds of noise. I'm like, what the hell are you doing? The car just started making noise. I'm like, all right, well, let's I'll go with you. Let's go for a ride around a block, whatever. And he starts going, that's making all kinds of noise. And then suddenly he had a push rod blow out the side of the block, and because it's a slant six, it basically blew out vertically,
right,
straight through the hood, left what looked like a bullet hole through the hood, and then just blew it completely out, and the car died. I was like, holy shit. And then I was like, wait, where's the oil? He's like, oil? I'm like, oh my God. And yeah, I opened the hood, pulled the fucking dipstick out, and it had nothing in it.
Nothing in it, yeah. Yeah, I wish, and I hate idiot lights because I can't rely on them. I mean, one, I'm not an idiot, but two, they are idiots. They don't go on when they should all the time.
Right.
Or
they go on way too early.
Yeah, they go on way too early, and then you get tempted to ignore it. Well, I had an Alpha, and the one good thing about the Alpha, with everything else that would fall off, break, be run into, or stop working electronically, it had an oil pressure gauge. And the only other car I've ever driven that had one was a Formula Ford. And I was driving along a local road in Massachusetts one day, and I came to a stoplight. So I got to stop. Light's red. And I happened to look down at the dashboard as I stopped. And I got to see the oil pressure gauge go from 2.3 psi to 0 on the peg.
Ooh.
And then when the car came to a stop, come back up to about 3. Now, the car was warm, so it should have had low oil pressure because the oil's very thin. But it should not drop to 0 when you stop.
No.
Luckily, there was a gas station right ahead of me on the left. So as soon as the light went green, I put on my turn signal and I pulled up and turned into the gas station. I pull up to the pumps and he's got a whole rack of 10W30 oil cans. I'm like, awesome. So I pop the hood and I take the oil cap off and I pour in a quart of oil. And then I check it with the dipstick and I don't see anything. So keep pouring. Second quart, third quart, fourth quart, check it again. Just come on the bottom of this, not even the bottom, a little bit. Let's try it. Fifth quart. Wow. Now the owner of the gas station's in the door of his little office and he's looking at me because he's counting too. And I get to the 7th quart of oil that I'm pouring in. Yeah. 7th quart of oil to pour into the Alpha. And I get about halfway done and I put the dipstick in and I take it out. And it's like, yep, that's almost full. Okay. 3/4 of the 7th quart go in, check it. Yeah, that looks good. Close everything up, close it down, slam it down, pick up all the oil cans and set them on the thumb. And he's walking over. And I noticed he'd been leaning over to look under the car. Like, is it draining out the bottom? And he goes to me and I said, how much for 7 quarts of 10W30? He said, where the hell did you put it? I said, the Alpha's, that car is half air cooled and half water cooled. It's got the biggest oil pan in the world underneath the engine. It takes 7.5 quarts of oil from dry.
Ooh. And
he went, you're shitting me. I said, nope. Its total capacity for oil is a little over 7 quarts, and I use 6 3/4. So thank God you were here with a rack full of this oil, because I wouldn't have gotten 500 yards with what was left in the engine. But that was a funny moment. And the only reason that I pulled in there and filled the entire engine with oil is because I had a pressure gauge, and I noticed that it fell off and came back up.
Right, and so no dummy lights came on, probably.
No dummy light ever came on.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I don't need a speedometer as much as I need an oil pressure gauge.
Right.
I drove a Formula Ford. It had a tachometer, an oil pressure gauge, and an engine temperature gauge. That's all I need.
Right.
I'll know I'm going too fast when the cops' lights come on.
Yeah. Well, and if you're keen enough, you can look at your RPM gauge, know what gear you're in, and go, yeah, I'm doing about this.
Oh, I did that with the Alpha because the speedometer packed it in about a year before I sold it. I had to do that all the time.
Yeah. I had to do that in the 66 Mustang because when I swapped the transmission out, 5-speed T5s they have electronic sensing. And of course, a 66 Mustang doesn't have any of that electronic bullshit.
Right.
So there's a kit that you can buy that you use the same cable for your speedometer. It just puts an elongated gear on the end that'll actually engage the gear that's in there. So
right. I
didn't have it at the time, and I plugged it in, and it kind of burnt a little bit and then didn't do anything. And I was like, shit, fuck it. So yeah, it was all. I had a Suntac mounted to the steering column, and I just went by the tachometer. I'm like, I'm in 4th gear. It's 1-to-1. I'm at like 1,800 RPM. I got a 350 geared rear end. Yeah, I'm probably doing, 45-ish. And yeah, it was pretty close. It was like 47.
Right.
So it was close enough to keep out of trouble.
Yes. Yeah. But to go back to our original question, I think we can conclusively say, and you can disagree with me all you want. Manufacturers' championships don't mean shit to anybody but the manufacturer, and
Well, yeah.
they aren't indicative of quality. They're indicative of how many cars they're going to sell the next day.
Well, pretty much. Yeah, no, I don't think we necessarily disagree. To me, it's if you could take two cars into a series and win a drivers' championship over another manufacturer dropping 10 cars in the series, I think you're doing just fine.
I agree.
Like, yeah. But yeah, I think we can kind of end it here. We're at like a little hour and 20 minutes. All right.
All right.
Let's see. What do you got going on?
Oh, let's see. Tuesday, I'm going to be on Nick Weiser's, on the 32 Flavors of Nick Weiser's channel, talking on Toxic Tuesday about a movie called Waterworld, which should be an entertaining conversation because I think I'm going to be the one person that didn't like it.
Well, I mean, if I go into the chat, I'll be with you because that was a god awful movie. That is a horrible movie.
Yep. And of course, as always, on Fridays, I'm on the MF Cocktail Lounge on Foul Ball Productions after FNT.
Yep.
That's it. And of course, I'm in lots of chats. Say hello. I'll say hi back.
Right. Wrenching away.
You're inching away.
All right. And what I'll probably end up doing, I mean, I earlier today I was on with 24/7 Fusion and Baron Norman Tag doing Primetime Kings, which we do every Sunday, roughly 3 hours ago. I'll be continuing that, and I'll come up with another topic for another stream. We'll try to keep this going. Not that we had a whole lot of people watching initially, but hey, for Papa Cotton, thank you for coming in. Looks like he may still be around. Maybe somebody's watching. And outside of that, yeah, you'll probably see me floating around fandom chats and whatnot, or maybe racing if I ever get back into it. But yeah, I think we're going to end it there. For those, Papa Cotton, thank you for stopping in. And anybody who may watch after the fact, thank you for stopping by. Leave a like and maybe subscribe. And hopefully I can get my channel to at least 100 subscribers. God forbid. But yeah, so to everyone, thank you and have a good night.
Be seeing you.